Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer dedicated to System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part 8 in an ongoing series talking about application deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's discussion will focus on distribution points and take a deep dive look at how distribution points work in Configuration Manager 2012. Certainly distribution points is a topic that can apply beyond application deployment, but definitely integral in application deployment. So we'll use this discussion as a framework to talk about the distribution point role, its function, and some of the mechanisms as to how it's built out, the structure, its role basically in storing content in Configuration Manager 2012. So this is the agenda. To start with, just a reminder on some of the abilities and the new things that are in place for distribution points in 2012. Certainly we've talked about distribution points already, dealing with applications. Can't deploy applications without distribution points. Can't deploy packages without distribution points. So we've definitely already worked with distribution points in some of the other discussions we've done, but today we'll focus strictly on the distribution point, see how it works, see how it's built, that kind of thing. So as a reminder to get started, in Config Manager 2012, there are two kinds of distribution points. There is still the legacy distribution point, the typical SMS PKG drive letter $share that we're familiar with since SMS 2.0. That distribution point folder will be present. However, it's only used in scenarios where you're deploying a package that is specifically configured to run from the distribution point. In other words, not download and execute. So in that scenario, we will still make the content available in that legacy share. But for everything else, including packages configured for download and execute, we're going to put the content in the new structure, distribution point structure, and that structure is named the SCCM content lib. That's the folder name of the new distribution point. And we're going to get into that and see how that's built, how it's different, and that kind of thing. But again, just as a way to set the framework and move through the presentation. So just to call your attention to some of the ways the SCCM content lib is different. First of all, it's the store for the content, but it's not only limited to the site server where the content is actually generated. So, in other words, let me say it this way. So the SCCM content lib folder will certainly be on every distribution point, but it's also going to be present on the CAS. And if you've followed through some of the other discussions I've had, I've mentioned several times that you cannot have the distribution point role on the CAS. In other words, the client will never use the CAS as a distribution point. If you go into the site systems for the CAS, there is no ability to configure it as a distribution point. However, the CAS definitely does have an SCCM content lib folder. And I'll ask you to think about why that might be. And I'll answer that for you in just a minute as I talk about some of these other items. So that's one thing. The other, it's a store for all content. And this is interesting because typically whenever, and that's not a big deal, certainly you think of a distribution point, the SCCM content lib folder, as being the store for all content, but typically you think of that store hosting. So let me say it this way. Maybe it'll be clear this way. So in Config Manager 2007 and SMS 2003, whatever, SMS 2.0, we had the legacy SMS PKG drive letter $. Folder. That was our distribution point. The only time that content showed up in that distribution point folder was when we actually selected to deploy the content to the distribution point. That's when we copied it to that folder in our various distribution point locations. That is true for some SCCM content lib folders, certainly those that are down-level distribution points at child primaries, those kinds of things, and we'll see that as we go through the talk today. But what's also true is the SCCM content lib folder, specifically as you'll see in our examples on the CAS, the content will be stored in that folder well ahead of selecting any distribution points. In other words, when we go through the Create Application wizard in our demos in a minute, you'll see that the content for our source directory is actually pre-cached into the content store, the SCCM content lib store. That is a very different thing from what we've done with distribution points historically. Certainly we will wait to send the content down to our child distribution points until those distribution points are selected. Again, you'll see that. But that is a different thing. Okay, one of the interesting reasons that's the case is because it does allow for content transfer optimization from the CAS to the distribution points at the child sites from the beginning. So, and again, I'll call that out as we go through some of the demos. The new SCCM content lib folder structure is built to allow for single instance storage. Again, we'll see that in some of the demos that we're going to go through. Specifically meaning that if the content is already cached there one time and the same content is used again in maybe another source directory that has some similar files, we will just simply put a pointer to the existing content rather than store it twice. So it reduces the size of the content library. All right. Another reason. So the SCCM content lib folder, if you look in this folder in structure, you're not going to really be able to easily make out the different files and such that are stored in that folder. The legacy SMS PKG drive letter $, folder, for anyone who knew where it was and whatever, you could go in there. The source files were stored, easily accessible. You could run them remotely, that kind of thing. No problem. The new structure of that obscures the content that's actually stored in the store. Makes it difficult to navigate through and find the various pieces of the source files in the store, but it also makes it very efficient for the system to manage those source files. One other point about this, the files stored in the SCCM content lib, again, very optimal way to handle files in the new structure, but it does prevent your ability to go directly run from the distribution point. That's one of the reasons that you will see no ability to do run from distribution point for applications. Certainly it's there, as we already mentioned, for legacy package support and that kind of thing. We'll do it in the legacy share. In the new content library store, there is no ability to run from DP. Another thing you'll notice as we go through the demo, historically, whenever we will compress content and send it down to child site distribution points, we do that by creating a PCK file and retain that so that we can reference it in the future and things like that. Now we don't do that anymore. We'll take a snapshot of the content, store it into the SCCM content lib, store it into the database. Again, we'll see that, but the PCK file is not retained. I'll show you that as we go through it. And certainly the new SCCM content lib and the new distribution point functions support validation of content if you choose to do so on a per distribution point basis on a schedule. So those are a few things about the new distribution point. Definitely some advantages to the new distribution point, and we'll see those. So other things we'll talk about, and we'll shift away from here and go to demos right away, is the new distribution point role. Talk about that. So talk about adding content to the SCCM content lib folder. Talk about the structure of the DP. We'll see some examples of single instance storage. Talk about how we distribute content to our child sites. And then finally talk about the database, distribution points and content, how those play into the database, and so on. So before moving into the demos, just a little graphic here that I wanted to call your attention to kind of illustrate at least a couple of the things that I was talking about. So basically here, you have your application and your deployment type that you're going to build. I will do that in the lab in just a second. As you go through the wizard and build your application and deployment type, one of the things that you're going to be asked is what your source directory is for your deployment type. So that's another thing, again, we've talked about is unique for applications. The source directory is defined on the deployment type, not on the application. So typically, or historically, the source directory has been defined on the package, not the program, right? Now in the application, it's defined on the application, on the deployment type, not the application, which enables the ability for a single application to have multiple source directories. And again, we'll see that in one of the demos coming up. So basically, you define your application, you define your deployment type, and you point it back to a source directory for the files that will feed and serve that application in the deployment type. Okay? When you point back to the source directory, you're creating a relationship between those items. Okay? But you haven't actually specified a distribution point yet. Doesn't matter. At that point, as soon as we know what the source directory is, we're going to proactively snapshot and place the files for that source content into the SCCM content library. So from that point, we can make judgments on the content, whatever else. Notice that the content that's in the content library, well, first of all, it's at the CAS, so it's not going to be available for any clients. There is no real DP role there. But even if it was a real DP, it's not available to clients yet because we don't have a deployment. The deployment is when we actually will deploy the content from the CAS down to a child level distribution point. It's also the place that we associate the deployment with the collection. So only when we create the deployment are we actually making the client aware of the application and the work to be done, and then the client will go try to access it from a distribution point. So again, content in the store, whether it's stored there by the application creation or by distributing it to the distribution point, is not accessible to clients yet. The reason why is because until we create a deployment, the client doesn't know that it needs to do anything with the content, so it doesn't try to ask for it. Okay. All right. So let's roll forward and talk about the distribution point role and the rest of this by letting examples serve to go forward. Okay, so let me pull in my lab. All right, get logged in, and the first thing we're going to do is actually go and create a new application. So the point of this, what I want to show you, is how the content actually gets stored in the SCCM content library even before we deploy it. So let me show you what I mean. So here I have my CAS, and if I look on my CAS, I have two folders. I have my legacy distribution point. Let's see, structure. Okay. Actually, I have the framework for it because this is not really a distribution point, and don't have any content deployed for legacy support, so I'm not going to ever have the SMS PKG drive letter $, but I do have the framework for it. Here's my SCCM content lib. Okay, so again, this is the CAS. This is not a distribution point, but this does have the SCCM content lib folder for storing content, helping make things efficient as we transmit content down the hierarchy, and so on. All right. So this is the folder I'm talking about. So I want to use. Let me go ahead and clear this out. I want to show you how when we create the application and the deployment type using the wizard, content gets pre-cached into this folder. Okay, so let me just show you right now. If we look at package lib, you see the different package IDs that are in here. When I create one in a minute, you'll see a new package ID come in and see some activity as a result. Let me get rid of all the stuff that's churning here. So what you see is on the screen is certainly the ConfigMgr console, and then you also see this tool Process Monitor. So the reason I have this in place is I want to be able to show you files as they get created in the SCCM content lib as a result of my my application creation, my deployment type creation, right? Even before we have the content deployed to a distribution point. By the way, the reason you saw it active there is it was reading the fact that I was accessing the SCCM content lib folder, because right now Process Monitor is filtered specifically only to show additions or changes or whatever to the SCCM content lib folder. All right. Here you see a window focused in on the SMS PKG folder on this same server. You won't see any activity here for the first demo, but I do have it here for a couple of other demos that I'll call your attention to as we go along. All right, so the first one, let's create an application. So here I'm just going to create an application and a deployment type. Again, what I'm creating doesn't really matter. I'm not trying to create a functional application. I'm just trying to create an application that will point to a source directory and then store stuff in the content library folder. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to create a manual application. So I'm going to call this Demo 1. All right, and then I'm going to go on through without filling anything else in. And then I'm going to, this is a little bit sluggish because procmon is running, so bear with me. Again, don't really care about that. And I'm going to go create my deployment type. And I'm just going to choose manual here, or script installer, and which will be manual. Demo 1 deployment type. All right, click next. And now I'm going to give it a content location. So, and I have a folder here, large package demo 1. So I've got a package here that has a number of files in it, just to show several pieces of activity in the proc monitor here. So here's my source directory, and what I want to do is just find any executable. It doesn't really matter. I'm just creating something to use quickly. All right, and that'll take a second. It'll pop in here as my source or my install program. Just a second. Come on. There we go. Here I've got to put in some detection logic. Again, just putting something here to get past the screen. That obviously would not work, but it gets me past the screen to show what I want to show. Take the rest of the defaults here and move on. All right, so finish out the deployment type, and that will finish out the wizard here in just a sec. Good enough. So now that's the deployment type. Let's go finish out the wizard for the deployment. And so we'll start doing some work here to create the application deployment type and so on. And let me call your attention here. So notice what I've done is I have only created the framework, the metadata, if you will. I've pointed to the source directory. I have not deployed content anywhere to any distribution point. I've just pointed to the source directory. So by that action, in Process Monitor, as soon as this wizard finishes up, we're going to see activity as we go through and store data into the SCCM content lib folder. Then what I want to do is kind of show you, comparing that with the distribution manager log, exactly what went on, kind of behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that takes place here that you won't necessarily see in the distribution manager log. So we'll let that spin up for a minute. You'll see a bunch of files dump into here in just a minute, and then we'll trace it back through the distribution manager log. Let me clear this out of the way and go actually get the distribution manager log. Got a number of there we go. You start to see some stuff dumping in, so we'll let that run just for a minute. Let me close down some of these multiple windows real quick while it's finishing up. All right, so let's see. All right, so I am on the CAS, and here are the log files. So let's go look in the distribution manager log, and then we'll come over here and look at the process monitor in just a minute. So distribution manager log records what I've done so far, and it's pretty simple when you look at the distribution manager log in terms of the processing that's happened. So we'll let that open up. It looks like it's still busy behind the scenes, but we'll let that open up for a second. So here again, timestamps are always our friend when we're looking at the logs. Timestamp make a lot of sense to track. Again, I can see it's not quite finished yet. You'll see a little bit more activity as we go along, but right about here we start to process right around 8:25, and you'll see that we found the notification file. Here's our new package ID Okay, so remember I told you that we would see this show up in the content library folder, and we will, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So here's the package ID. This is the same kind of ID name, if you will, that we're familiar with from looking at packages historically in ConfigMgr 2007 and SMS 2003 and so on. There's also going to be a unique content ID assignment for it that we'll see here in just a minute. In fact, here it is, content underscore 0597 whatever. Okay, so those two IDs are going to be important as we look into the structure of the content library folder. Okay, it looks like we're still finishing up some processing here, so we'll let it finish up. Should be almost done, and we'll see some activity. So basically, it's taking a snapshot. So you see right here at 625 that it's working on taking a snapshot of the structure, and we just moved forward. Looks like so 625 to 627, we were taking a snapshot of the folder. And then at 627, we say the total size of the content in kilobytes and so on. And there'll be a little bit more added to the log in just a minute. So there we go. So finishing up, adding content, and then we should be just about done. Successfully connected, created content, whatever. So basically that's it, right? We created the content in the content store. We took the snapshot, which I'll show you what that did in just a minute, and then finally we finished up and we replicated the information to the child sites, right? Replicating to all applicable sites. Now, what this means is we're replicating the metadata, not the content data. Okay, so I'll show you in a minute that in the CAS we actually have the content stored in the content library. In the child sites we don't yet. Right? It's only at the CAS. So we did replicate the metadata. We have not specified any other DPs or any DPs at all yet, so we have not replicated beyond the CAS where this has been defined. Okay? So, but let's call back to this this time period up here. So up here, we worked to take a snapshot of the data. That took us roughly 2 minutes to do, right? And then we had our next log entry. So what happened between this entry and this entry? Well, if we go over to our trace and look here at 625, 625.16, we started working on it. 625.14, we actually see some activity and start to spin up. So here, let me just maximize this for a minute. We basically see a quick checking out of the content lib, and then we start to see a bunch of activity where we're creating files in the structure, just line after line after line of creating files until we scroll all the way down to the bottom. Let's get down there a little bit faster, hopefully. Down to 627, so on 49, whatever, 627.49, which correlates roughly to around here. So all during that 2-minute roughly window where we're seeing no activity in the distribution manager log, what we're actually doing in the snapshotting process is looking back at our source directory, looking at all the files that are part of the source, adding those or comparing those, if you will, to the content lib content. In our case, we're having to create information in the content library and add the files into the content library, put them in the database, that kind of thing, because they weren't there, right? So in this case, the content wasn't in the content library. We added it to the content library, and that was all taking place for the 2 minutes, so that we could get our source directory staged over there. All right. Now, so that's the first demo, right? And how it works. So now that we have some content in the content library, I want to show you what the structure of that content library is all about. So let me go ahead and get rid of the distribution manager log for a minute and pull up the content lib folder. So back here, back in the content lib. All right. So I mentioned that our package ID was was 59, I believe. Let me back up for a minute. I'm too far. There we go. Let's do this first. Was 59. So if we look in our sccm content lib folder, we're going to see three folders. The package lib, which stores our package ID information, okay? The data lib, which will store the data information about the content that we just stored, and the file lib, which stores all the different files that were part of our content. I'll walk through each one of these. So if we start in package lib, and we look back at distribution manager log, I pointed out that we had this ID, CAS00059. So that is a unique identifier for the content that we just stored into the content lib store, right? This is an INI file that gives some more information about the content that's stored here. So if I open up this file and look, basically it tells me that my package information, the actual pointer, is going to be this content 05973. That's the other marker that I pointed out in the distribution manager log. This is the other unique tag, and that's what's going to be looked at and referred to as we go to the next folder. Okay, here's some unique flags about the content, whatever. So basically, the CAS ini file is linking to the actual package source location. So here's 59. So let's go back to our data lib now. So if we look in data lib, we don't see now 59, but we do see this content 059 folder. We also see another configuration file with the same ID. So if we look in the configuration file, we'll basically see a hash value for the content as a whole and what hash algorithm was used. Okay, so that's the hash value representing the content as a whole. And then in this folder, we will see what looks to be the source directory. So let's pull this up for a minute. So if we look back at our source directory that we pointed to as part of our deployment type, here we have large package demo 1. This is our source directory. Boy, that sure looks familiar, doesn't it? So same folder structure, same everything else. If I just go into 0409, I'll see a couple of files in here. A .ini, a .ini. That's probably not the best example. Let's go in here first. Advanced installers. Okay, so I have a couple of DLLs in here, right? If I go to advanced installers, actually in the content lib, notice I have the same files, DLLs, but these are actually not the files. These are INI files representing the actual DLL file. So even though it looks like I have the source directory in this folder, I don't. I have the structure that defines the source directory folder structure and the files that were in the source directory structure, but I don't actually have the files here. I just have very small INI files, kind of placeholders, that are essentially pointing to the location in the single instance store where those files can be found. Okay, so let me just take this example. If I want to know where the file cmiadapter.dll is actually stored, this information will tell me. Okay? Now, you may not be able to read this and tell you that this information, or know that this information tells you that, but it does, right? So a couple of things just quickly to point out that we'll reference. So first of all, here's the file size. So the size of cmadapter.ini, let's just pull that up again to prove it. There we go, and here we go. So if we scroll over the top level file, okay, the size of that 123 KB, so 125/440. If we go to the properties on this file, then we'll even see the detail, and that should agree, the actual file size. So 125/440 is the actual size in bytes. 125/440 is the actual size recorded in the INI file. Also, we have a hash value. This hash value represents the file itself. So the other hash value was the hash of the content as a whole. This is the hash value of the file itself, along with the file size. So now if I want to go over into the, now remember, these first four characters, okay, of the hash value, 277E. So if I take this information and want to go actually into the file lib structure here, or I'm sorry, yeah, the file lib structure here, now I can go and use that information I just showed you and find the actual file. So here, let's see. We're looking for 277E. Let me just see if I can find it this way. Okay, there it is. So instead of drilling through it, so here's 277E. It's one of those folders I was just looking at in the file lib. So if I open up this folder, well, first of all, the reason 277E, that first 4 characters of the hash value for that file is what's used to name the folder under file lib. And so by going into the folder under file lib, I can see that there's actually a file here that's 123 KB. That is the size of the actual file that we're trying to store. So this is the actual file that we're trying to store. There's some extra configuration signature stuff in here as well, but this is the actual file that we're trying to store. So whenever the store tries to look up the file, it can find it right here. And the beauty of this is that if we have this same file that's part of the source directory for another application, and it's the exact same file, we're going to hash it, we're going to find the hashes match, and we're not going to have to store it again because there's already a file in the library that has the same hash, therefore it's the same file, therefore it doesn't need to be stored again. We just need to link to the existing file. So yes, we're going to add content to the store to link to the existing file, but we're not going to store the file multiple times. So the links themselves are very, very small files compared especially to storing the actual files multiple times. So you see the advantage of keeping the size down on the disk of the content store when you have duplicated files in various applications. Okay, so that's what we saw. All that activity was taking place in the process monitor whenever we went through that. So let's go on to our next example. So what I want to do now is actually go store another, go create another application and deployment type and store that over in the single instance store and show what happens there. Okay. Oh, and by the way, as I'm talking about the distribution point, the structure, that kind of thing, one question to ask here. So you see now that we create the information in the content store right away, right? And we don't wait to actually deploy to a distribution point. It's created as soon as we finish up the wizard and point to the source directory. Let me minimize this again now. And I'm actually going to clear the content again. Okay. So we're still capturing, but we'll capture more whenever we do the next one. So now we know the content's in the store, right? We didn't have to deploy to a DP. We just created the application in the wizard. So since we did not actually select a DP, let me ask the question this way. So typically, whenever we've created a package and program in the past, no content has been stored in the DP folders until we actually selected a DP. So if you wanted to clean the content up from the distribution point store, it was a simple matter of removing the distribution point associated with the package. Now that we actually store the content in the content library before we ever assign a DP, the question is, how do you clean the content out of the store since it's just put there automatically as part of creating the application? The answer is the only way to clean the content out of the content lib store at the CAS is to delete the application. Certainly, if you have deployed it to child level distribution points, yeah, you can remove the distribution point association. We should clean it out of the store at that time, no problem. But at the CAS, where we create it and put it in the content lib store from the beginning, right? Or whatever site you put it in the content lib store by creating it from the beginning, typically the CAS. The only way to remove that content from the store is to actually delete the application. Then we'll go through and clean up the content library store and the database of the content. Until then, we leave it there. Okay, and the reason that's important, especially on the database side, cleaning up the database, is to support revision history, being able to go back in time and restore versions and so on. Again, we kind of saw that when we talked about the application deep dive. We saw how as we created different versions of an application, we stored uniquely in the database configuration items related to that. and use that to support the revision history. So it all kind of ties together. Again, the only way to remove it from the content library store where you create the package is to actually delete the content. All right. Okay. So let's go to the next demo, and what I want to do here again is just create a new application, kind of the same way we did the first one, but this time I want to create and point to a source directory that actually contains very much the same content with just 2 extra files. Okay, so this will be demo 2. Add my deployment type. This will be a script installer. Again, don't really care what the application all is. I just really want to point to the content. And this time I'm going to use large package with added files demo 2. And here I'm just going to browse, and there's 2 files. So this source directory is exactly the same. It's just that I've added 2 files. These are text files. Obviously those won't work here for deployment, but I'll put them in just to get past the wizard. And those are the 2 unique files that are part of this. I will put in, again, my information to get past this. Oops. Good enough. And now we'll go create this. Alright, finish that out. Finish out the wizard here, and so now we are creating the package. And again, call your attention to the fact that process monitor is running. It's going to capture all the activity here. What you see, in essence, so one might think, so I mentioned to you already that since we have information in the content store already, we're not going to restore that information. That's absolutely true. But what we are going to do, you'll see, so one would think by that statement that you wouldn't see a tremendous amount of activity perhaps in process monitor as we're storing off and evaluating the content to put in the library. And that's true in one sense, that there won't be as much activity, but you'll definitely see a lot of information fly by in process monitor. Because remember, what we're doing, the content, for the most part, except for those 2 added files, is already in the content store. There we go. We start to see activity. However, this is a new application. This is a new iteration, if you will, that we have to accommodate in the content library. So what we have to do, even though the content is already there, we have to create links to the existing files. So we're not actually storing the files multiple times, but we are creating the link files that will reference the files that are already there. Okay? So let's go look in the content library folder. We may not be totally done yet, but we'll go look at it anyway and see what we have now. So in our package lib, now we have our new file type. It may not quite be there yet. Let's let it finish up. Okay, so actually here it is. So 5A. This is our new content that was added. So like before, we can track that back and see how this links in. This is going to be our new content ID. So content underscore FB0. Okay. So if we go into content underscore FB0 in our data lib, notice that we have our same folder structure. So let's just follow this through. Well, we have our same folder structure plus our 2 extra files that were added. So let's follow this through and see how this works. So here's that file we were looking at. So this file, as all of this stuff, was already in the content store whenever I deployed this second application. So in theory, all of this should already be there and just link across to the same file. So if we look in here, then we see, in fact, that we do reference the same file. So if you remember, last time we went through this, whenever the content was first stored in the content store, we had the same hash value, 277E. We went to the folder in the file lib, in the folder that was named 277E, saw the actual content there. So here, this is the new source that's stored out here. Now we just create a link to that existing file because it's the same hash value, same size. All right. But then here we we actually have two new files, so we uniquely stored these two files into the content library because there was no opportunity just to create the link. They're new. All right. Not to belabor that point. All right. Cool. So definitely saw some activity in Process Monitor because of all the linkages that were being created, writing all those INI files, but we didn't actually store the content more than one time for those files that were in common. All right, so not to belabor that, let's move on to the next part of the discussion. So now that we've stored information, just created the application, the deployment type, what we want to do now is go through and deploy that content to a distribution point at a child primary site. So here's where we're going to actually see some activity where we compress the content to send it down. Again, we don't want to just send files across the WAN link to our child site. That would take a lot more activity across the WAN potentially than compressing that and first sending. So we are still going to compress it and send it down to the child sites, just like we've done before. But now you're going to notice that we actually don't keep the PCK files. All right, so let's go do that. So now let me go deploy or distribute this content. So the first distribution point I'm going to choose is just distribution point locally at my child site. So here I'll choose PS1. Okay, and easy as that. I'll run through this. We'll see it working in just a second. You'll see some PCK files that are created here. In fact, I'm going to blow that up just for a minute so we can see some information. So one thing I'm going to note, because it's important to keep track of some stuff in a minute, is once we see the PCK file there, so 161 KB is, or you see it growing there as we compress. So 8921 KB looks to be the size of the compressed content. So this is the full source being sent down for our first package. We've never sent this before. It's the first time we're sending down the content for the package or for the application, and so that's the full size of the content going down. Let me drop this down again, and you can see here that we've still got the source directories in place, or we have the package files, PCK files in place. But if you watch this folder as we roll on through, and I'll point it out as soon as I see it, these files are not retained. So in Configuration Manager 2007, the files are retained, leading to some extra disk space that you have to account for in a hierarchy for those PCK files. Here we keep them long enough to do what we need to do with them, and then they're removed because we now have the content library and we can use it to make judgments on the same kind of things we used to use the PCK file for. So there's really no need to retain it. All right, so you'll see that disappear. Let's look in the log and see what actually happened for distributing this content. So if we go into Program Files, Config Manager, Logs, look at our Distribution Manager log. Okay. So again, not a tremendous amount here, but we do see, again, following the timestamp, we see some activity start up around here. Okay. Found that we're going to work on this package 59. And a couple of unique things. First of all, package here doesn't have a sender. We realize that it needs to be down to PS1 now. We need to send a compressed copy. We're working on sending this down. We're going to have to compress the content first, so we're going to use drive C to do that. Here's where we go through the compression, and then ultimately, once we're done with the compression, Distribution Manager hands off now to the site-to-site communication mechanism to actually send that content down to the child site. Now, from here, we actually move out of the distribution point realm, if you will, and more into the site-to-site sending realm that is part still of Configuration Manager 2012. Just as a reminder, there's now two mechanisms that help keep content, if you will, in sync between sites in a hierarchy. One is the traditional legacy site-to-site communication mechanism for moving file-based content. Things like what you see here, the application, the source directory, the WEM files, software update files, those kinds of things. Then there's the SQL replication piece, where we move metadata. That would include the definitions of the application, the definitions of the software update, the site control files, collection replication, that kind of thing. All right, so definitely two ways to replicate data between sites. Content like this still moves in the legacy site-to-site communication mechanism. So that's where we hand off to now when the mini job's created. So we could break the discussion at this point and just move to the child site, but to have continuity, let me just remind you, not going to get off in the weeds on this at all, but let me just remind you what's happened after we create the mini job. So from here, Distribution Manager creates the mini job and basically hands that off to the Replication Manager component. So we could trace that through in the file structure and the inbox structure and actually see all that happen if we introduce the proper breaks in the action and so on. But we could also track it in the log. From here, Replication Manager works on it, gets it ready for sending down to the child sites, and once everything's ready, it will send a notification to the scheduler component that basically says there's content that needs to move. It notifies scheduler by creating a job file. So scheduler sees that job file, goes through, looks at all the activity happening on the site, inserts the job into the mix, and starts to work on it, get it scheduled to send down. The way scheduler does that ultimately is it puts an entry into sender, and sender starts to move the content. So I will actually open this log file to show you how some of this looks. So definitely we see the content being written over to our site. So here we look at the timestamp. We know that it was around the time that we were working. So this is definitely the content that we just sent down. We know that it's going to our child site. We know it's going to this folder called SMS_site. All right, on the child site. So this folder on the child site. Let me just go to our child site just for a minute to finish this up for continuity. So if I go to my child site real quick. And look down at the structure here. So let me go into the inbox structure real quick. It's like this server's being a little bit slow. That's all right. We'll work with it. Alright, so configuration manager, so inboxes. So we were sending to SMS_site. So if you look, dspooler receive folder is actually the SMS_site folder. So if we look here at properties and look at sharing, we will see that this is actually shared as SMS_site. So the dspooler receive folder is where all content that moves from one site to another is actually placed, because now dspooler has to look at that content, figure out what to do with it. Let's see if we even have any files. Yeah, that's already moved out. Figure out what to do with it and then act accordingly. So basically we could trace that by looking at our dspooler log here. We'll see our dspooler component that looks at the content when it arrives, figures out what needs to happen with it. Ultimately, in this case, it will go to the distribution manager component, and the distribution manager component will act upon it and place it forward. Oh, one thing I forgot to show you here. Sorry about that. I just completely slipped my mind. But until we actually sent the content down just now to the primary site, that content wasn't in the content store. Right? The act of adding the distribution point is what caused that content to roll down to the primary site and get stored in the content library. Until then, it wasn't there. Okay, and actually, I can show you that. Let me show you that real quick. Sorry, I forgot to do that earlier, but I can actually do that for you. So here, sorry, there's a D drive here. It's bigger, so this is where it'll be. Okay, so here's our SCCM content lib, and here's our package library. And if you'll remember, actually, it looks like it may not even be here yet. Yeah, it's okay. So we don't have it. We don't have it communicated down yet. Let's see. yeah, it's not quite here yet, even now. So it looks like it's still in process. So we'll get that to happen in a minute. So that alone shows you I've communicated that down, and it's not in the content library store yet. So we should be good to go. Let me actually take another look at this to make sure. Yeah, okay. So good to go. We are not actually in the content library store yet. We still have some processing to go on. Let's take a look at Distribution Manager, see where we are in processing that real quick. So this is Distribution Manager on our primary site. So here we actually see 59 has actually shown up. It should be here by now, 8:57. Let's see. Okay. Okay, sorry, I was confusing myself for a minute, or looking right past it. So there is the SCCM content lib on the C drive. I was looking at a different box, I think, and confusing myself. So my bad. This is actually a VM running on my VM host, and I was looking at my VM host drives without even realizing that I was. So apologize for that. Here's my VM. That is my primary site. And my primary site files are right here. So SCCM content lib. So the SCCM content lib on my primary site definitely contains my file that refers to the package that I just sent down, 59. But you'll remember that on my CAS I actually created two applications and deployment types. One was 59, that's the one I just sent down, and there was the other one, which is 5A. 5A has not been sent down to this distribution point yet, and you see that it's not here. So that information alone will kind of confirm for you that until we actually send down to the distribution point, it doesn't get down to the local content library on your child sites. Okay, so that actually moved through. You saw in the distribution manager log that it was decompressed and so on. Let me just show you that since I'm on the server again. Let me make sure of that we were looking at the right log. So distribution manager log here will show you that file that was received and processed. This is a notepad view. We don't have trace on this server, so apologies for that. But here you definitely see that CAS 09 is being processed in the distribution manager log, and so we're good to go. All right. So sorry about that. I confused myself. So we definitely moved that down. Now let's go back to the CAS for just a minute. You pop that out and move that down. All right, good enough. So here we're back to the CAS, and let's minimize this for a minute. And notice now that my PCK file is gone. So I did keep a record of the size of my PCK file. Okay. And we'll reference that here in just a minute. Now, I sent demo 1 down to the site to the distribution point that is on the same server as my primary site, PS1. I also have the ability to add a remote distribution point, which I'll do now. So let me distribute content now, not to my local distribution point, but to my remote distribution point, and see how that works. So here I will add a distribution point and add this one, which is a remote distribution point, and send this out. All right. So the point of this is, so when we have the distribution point local on the site server, there's no need to do any kind of throttling or anything else, because it's basically just a local disk transfer on the site server. But on the remote distribution point, we have the ability to do that because if you have some sensitive WAN links, that kind of thing, you might want to do some throttling. In this case, I don't have any throttling turned on. Okay, no limitations at all to my remote distribution point. So when this content goes down, it's going to be handled a little bit differently. Meaning that we're going to have to move it to the remote distribution point. So there's another component that gets involved. We'll see if it's happened yet. go to my primary site so I don't confuse myself. Here, let me maximize that. There's a component that handles that, specifically new to ConfigMgr 2012, called Package Transfer Manager. So if I look in my log files, hopefully we've seen activity happen already. Look in my log files, and look here for Package Transfer Manager, we'll see the log file. And in this log file, we will see information as this data is copied out to our remote distribution point. In fact, yeah, we see information right here. Very similar, by the way, to exactly the same, really, as what I saw in the sender log. So you'll recall that I stopped at the CAS and showed you the sender log so you could see some of this information. I did that because in the Package Transfer Manager, you see this information. As we're sending content from the primary site to our remote distribution point, it's exactly the same as the engine that handles site-to-site transfer. It's just this time we're going to our remote distribution point. Also, another thing for those that are familiar with reading the logs in 2007 and so on, we have this kind of information in it too. This looks very similar to the kind of logging you would see in Scheduler, and that's absolutely pretty much exactly what it is, right? Scheduling content out to our remote distribution points and so on. So those two functions are put together now in Package Transfer Manager log. So that was moving the content from our site server down to our remote distribution point at our primary site. So let's do another one, okay? And this will be our final demo that I want to show. And I want to do kind of a double whammy here for this last one. So let me go back to the CAS. So if I go back to the CAS, remember I have my second demo. The second demo is essentially got a deployment. It's got a deployment type right now created that is pointing to a source directory that is, for all intents and purposes, except for two files, it's the exact same file structure as what we have for the first deployment. So here I'm going to go ahead and deploy this to a remote distribution point. But before I do this, let me actually go and enable throttling now at this distribution point, the remote one, and see what the difference is. So let me turn throttling on here. Won't be a huge difference, but it's worth seeing. There we go. So come up to rate limit. I want to specify a limit across the whole spectrum. I want to be at 50%. Or let's just say 10%. Let's have fun with it. Okay, good enough. So we're at 10% of the link. Let that process go through. So let me go back to the software library. So again, I've sent demo 1 down. All the content's in the content store right now. I have not sent demo 2 down. The content for demo 2 is all essentially the same except for a couple of files. So I have never deployed demo 2 before. So as soon as I can get control back in the console, I will go add a distribution point for demo 2. Okay, so let's distribute that content. Again, I will just choose the remote distribution point. Add distribution point. Here we'll choose our remote one. Good enough. Next, and off we go. So you see the content being compressed again. We're sending it across just like before. But now let's go to the child primary site. Okay. So if we get over there, and back in Package Transfer Manager log. So hopefully we'll have some activity here by now. So not yet. So we'll actually wait for the content to get down here and be acted upon. Just for a second. Let's see. Okay, it took it just a second for us to get that notification down and process it by despooler at the child site. But now that we have, let me just show you what just happened. I'll pause this log. So just as a reminder, we already had sent the content down to the child site. The content was essentially exactly the same, save 2 files being added. So we started working on the content, we received it, we have a delta update, and we start looking at the delta update, and we realize that all of these files are actually in place. So there's no reason to copy them across the link to the remote distribution point again, because they haven't changed. They're exactly the same, right? We will have, a couple of files in this mix that need to be updated. I'll go look for those in just a second. But essentially, we process everything. We don't copy the ones that are already out there. We just copy the ones that are unique. All right. So not to belabor the point. So that kind of wraps up the demos end to end that I wanted to take you through. Watching how content first is stored in the content library, then transmitted down to our child sites. There's one more thing that I want to do here. So there is a component, the database component as well. So just for education purposes, let me show you how the database component is involved. So we talked a lot in the applications discussion about how configuration items are used pretty extensively for applications. Well, configuration items also come into play whenever we're talking about content in the content store. So always with the database, showing you for information purposes, but definitely don't touch the information in here unless it's just looking at stuff for education purposes. So a few key places just to show you quickly. So there are certainly a few CI tables, configuration item tables, that come into play for looking at content information for packages. So here we have the CI contents table in the database, and if we look at that table, we'll see that as soon as the query finishes executing, that here we store information about the content ID. So all pieces of content are assigned a unique ID. Here's that GUID, again, if you will, GUID-like number that we saw in the logs, assigned to a unique content ID. You'll see that in another table here in just a minute. Version information, size information, source directory information, and other such, right? Kind of a pointer content flags and so on. So with this information, if we want to understand what the associated files are for the content, notice that we have a CI_content files. Here's that content ID column again. So if I scroll down to 102, for example, all of these files are the ones that were in the source directory for this demo application. And if you notice, all of these files are stored here. File name, okay, so I scroll over, file name, as well as the file version, the file size, any hash information, whether it's signed, the storage hash, all this information. So very useful here to be able to look quickly at content that might be under evaluation, figure out if it's the same content, hash it, that kind of thing, and it's all stored here. Other information here at the CI tables would be CI content packages as an example. Right here, if we scroll up, there's another table that will show the packages. Let me quickly pull that in. Okay. So, oops, helps if I actually type a star there, doesn't it? Yeah. So basically, the content ID, the associated package information. So there's the mapping, there too. So and mapping all the way through to the unique ID. So good information stored in the database if you need to get to it. Another piece that is interesting, and maybe even more interesting than just knowing that, because again, there's not a whole lot you're going to do with that. It's just more for education than anything else. Is to understand the distribution point tables, the key tables that we use for looking up content. So when the client, for example, goes, and we'll see this basically when we go through the client discussion in the next couple of sessions, when the client receives the policy that knows that it has an application or a package or whatever to run, it's going to need to go look up content, find out the distribution points that are available with that content that it has rights to, right? The way it does that is it will send up a location request to the management point. The management point receives that location request, actually runs a stored procedure against the database, and pulls the information out of the database and transmits the result back to the client. In the client side, if we get a distribution point back, the client's happy. We go get the content, run the deployment. If we don't get a distribution point back, then the client's not able to run the deployment. So sometimes in troubleshooting, you need to understand what that process is doing. Ultimately, what it's doing is running stored procedures against the database to figure out where the various distribution points are that have the content available for the client. So a couple of key ones. Again, I'll run through most of these very quickly, but just to call your attention to them. There's this one called Content DP Map. So this is interesting. This one will show you all of the distribution points that host the given content. So in my case, we have 59 and 5A. So we'll use 59 as an example. It's on just a couple of distribution points, right? So I've got it on, or two actually. So here's 59, it's on PS1, and it's on the remote distribution point. Here's 5A, it's on just our remote distribution point. All right. So we can quickly see the map. Well, there's other tables here. So here's the content ID and server path and all that. Here's other tables that are involved in some of the decisions too. So if we go up to the distribution or go down to the distribution points grouping, okay, we'll have a table that defines the distribution points. We have a table that defines which distribution points are in a given distribution point group. We have a table for the status of the distribution points, the distribution status itself, information for the distribution status. We have tables, if we go on down here, for DP group collections. So if you actually create a DP group right here, if you create a DP group and associated collection, that's all mapped here. Membership of a DP group. DP group packages, so all the packages that are actually assigned to a DP group, which is interesting. DP info, so here's an interesting one. Let's just run a query against it. All right. So information about a given distribution point, what the site code is, whether it's a protected distribution point or not, and various other things. So again, that's all I want to do in terms of showing you some of the stuff in the database. Database is always interesting in certain cases, certainly for educational purposes. It's typically not an area that will need to be worked on without the assistance of someone from support, but very, very useful to know some of the information that's there. So with that, we'll wrap up this session. And the next couple of sessions we'll move back to the client side, and there we will take a look at the inner workings of the client. In some ways, that probably is more useful than what we've done in the past couple of sessions for day-to-day troubleshooting. On the client side, understanding how the information flows through the logs is oftentimes critical for pinpointing where problems are happening, troubleshooting, knowing where to look, that kind of thing. So we'll do that in the next two sessions, and we'll talk to you then.